Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part 8 as we look at the Protestant Reformation, third portion of Christianity. And we left off with the Reformation in England, Protestant Reformation in England, where, of course, you have King Henry VIII, the king, who is trying to get his marriage annulled because he feels that the marriage should have never taken place from the beginning. He sends a request to the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, Clement VII. The Pope looks favorably on Henry's request, but he doesn't act on it. Well, due to the Pope's refusal to act, Henry VIII, King Henry VIII, he broke communion with Rome, the Catholic Church, and he established the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. Anglican refers to English. And the Anglican Church identifies itself as Catholic yet Protestant and Protestant yet Catholic. The Church of England sees itself in many respects as a middle ground, a middle way between Protestantism and Catholicism. And in many respects, it is a liberal version of Catholicism. Um, to add some points with that, Pope Benedict XVI, when he was Bishop of Rome, when he was Pope, one of the things that he established within the Latin rite of the Catholic Church, Latin or Roman rite, which is the dominant rite of the Catholic Church, there are 23 other rites, but the Latin or Roman one, what's commonly referred to as Roman Catholic, is the largest. And he established within the Latin rite an Anglican ordinance. And essentially, here was the reason behind that. The Church of England, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, it is overall theologically liberal. But there are some Anglicans, some conservative Anglicans that do not like the liberalness within the Church of England. So, by the Pope establishing an Anglican ordinance, essentially they are allowed to come into the Catholic Church while maintaining elements of their Anglican tradition, such as, for example, the Book of Common Prayer, or that the scriptural readings are from the King James Version of the Bible, which is English Protestantism's most famous translation and a product of the Church of England. Now, on the other side, you do have some Catholics who are liberal and don't like some of the many conservative principles within the Catholic Church. I might as well mention that, um, on a lot of social justice issues, the Catholic Church is very liberal, but on other things like, the ordination of women, birth control, abortion, homosexuality, it's pretty conservative. And there are a number of Catholics, liberal Catholics, that don't, agree with the church on those issues. So many of them, look to the Anglican Church. To give an extra example of that, someone that I knew, former pastor of mine, Father John, his brother came out as gay, and his brother ended up becoming an Episcopalian. The Episcopal Church is the commonmost form of the Church of England here in the United States. And Father John never completely said it, but kind of reading between the lines, I don't think that he liked the fact that his brother left the Catholic Church and became an Episcopalian, but he understood why he did. And might as well add to that, and this may be changing a little bit as I'm recording this with members of the Catholic clergy, but certainly for decades, and I'd say around the time, Father John was ordained, which was probably, I'm going to say in the late 1960s, would have been after Vatican II. He mentioned to me how the lower members, you could say, of the clergy within the Catholic Church, the presbyters slash priests, the deacons, the sisters, even though they're not part of the ordained clergy, but still, how they tend to be liberal, but the bishops who are the bosses tend to be conservative. Well, one other thing to mention before moving on, I thought that I would, mention the areas which became Protestant, which embraced um, Protestantism in the West, Western Europe more specifically. Um, Essentially, the British Isles, with Ireland as an exception. Ireland is predominantly Catholic. Even the northern portion, which is part of the United Kingdom, it's split about 50-50 between the Protestants and the Catholics, but overall, it's Catholic. But, outside of that, England, obviously, Church of England, Wales, Church of England, Scotland, Church of Scotland, which is essentially the Presbyterian Church, and then the Scandinavian countries, which are Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, they went over to Protestantism, Lutheran. The Netherlands went over to Protestantism. The Dutch Reformed Church, which is essentially Calvinist, but the Dutch people are not very religious. In fact, about 55% identify as irreligious. So the Catholics, at least in terms of a practicing religion, have taken over, I guess you could say again, um, but the Netherlands did go over to Protestantism, Calvinism more specifically, and northern Germany went over to Protestantism. Of course, that was where Luther was located. Northern Germany, of course, you have the Lutheran faith, and then you have, a form of Lutheran and Calvinist um, that, would identify what's called evangelical Lutheran and Calvinist, evangelical and Reformed referring to Calvinist. Um, but the southern portion of Germany remained Catholic. So now look a little bit at some of the common elements within Protestantism. Well, one would be the biblical canon, but I have there in parentheses non-Anglican. One of the things that's often stated is how Catholic Bibles and Protestant Bibles, and we could also throw in Orthodox Bibles, are different. Well, where they differ is in terms of their Hebrew Bible, or what Christians would call the Old Testament, basically their Old Testament canon. In terms of New Testament, everybody agrees with the same number of books. And how is that? Well, during the time period of Luther, there was the notion of going back to the sources. And the Jewish people rejected what's called the Deutecanonicals, essentially the works that came out of the Septuagint, such as the Maccabean books and the Book of Wisdom and whatnot. And so, since the Jewish people rejected these works, we should as well. It doesn't change their historical status, those works, such as the Maccabean books. They tell the Hanukkah story, but we do not consider them to be divinely inspired. I will mention Luther, he did want to remove some works of the canonical New Testament, those particular works being James, Jude, Hebrews, and Revelation. The major reason why is because he did not find them to be Christ centered enough. But historians have focused on really the letter of James, and Luther hated the letter of James. He referred to it as the Epistle of Straw and whatnot. And perhaps a major reason why is because James is seen as challenging Luther on a major teaching that Luther held, the sola fide, the faith alone, which is one of the pillars of Protestantism. And public pressure stopped Luther from removing those works, but the letter of James is the one that a lot of historians have focused on, where Luther seemed to really, really have a temper with, on that issue. We'll get on. We'll mention later about the issue of the sola fide, but it's often viewed that the reason that Luther wanted to remove that work, and notwithstanding the others, but that work in particular, was because it was seen as a challenge to one of his prominent theological points of view. And also the notion of two sacraments, baptism and communion, or the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, but again, they're non Anglican. As I forgot to mention a moment ago, the Church of England, they maintain those writings as part of the Septuagint with their liturgy, so that's why I have them here as non Anglican. But anyway, Protestantism, generally, Protestants recognize two sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist or the Holy Communion, over the traditional seven. There are some Protestants that essentially don't have any sacraments, but the majority recognize two, baptism and the Eucharist, the Holy Communion. But again, the Church of England, they maintain the traditional number of seven. The priesthood of all believers over the traditional church structure slash hierarchy. Again, there I have in parentheses non Anglican. One of the traditional understandings of baptism is that everybody is a priest. You share in the priesthood of Christ, which is viewed by the author of the letter to the Hebrews to be superior to the Jewish priesthood. And so everybody is considered a priest. But then you also have what's called the ordained priesthood by the laying on of hands, where you have the bishop, the presbyter slash priest, and then the deacon. Protestantism puts an emphasis on the priesthood of all believers, which would be all baptized Christians, over that traditional church structure slash hierarchy. Now, there are many Protestant churches that do maintain it, but their theological understanding is different from what you would find within, say, a Catholic, Orthodox, or Anglican church. But, even despite that, I do think that, some of that traditional church structure is still there, even within those Protestant communities. I remember once having an argument slash discussion on this with my former professor, who was an ordained Lutheran minister, where I essentially, said to her, well, I'm a baptized Christian. Why can't I walk into your church and start preaching? And her response was, well, you haven't been called. And I was like, well, how is that any different from the person that's called, the priest, the presbyter slash priest? Well, I understand the theological differences, but I do think some of that structure is still there in some regard. In some way, it's still there to a degree. But, again, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, they maintain the traditional structure and authority of the bishop, the presbyter slash priest, and then the deacon. Well, we're going to need to stop here, but when we come back, we will finish up the little bit that we have left with Protestantism. So take care. I will symbolically see you then.